Today I'm going to show you how to shim the calipers on a set of Baer brakes and give you a couple of tips and tricks to keep yourself out of trouble while doing it. It's not a complicated process, but their instructions aren't very clear, so I'm going to show you how to do it. So the idea behind shimming up the calipers on these Baer big brake kits is to center the caliper on the rotor so the pads contact the rotor at the same time. Now this is a great example. After installing this front kit, you can see that on one side I have an awful lot of clearance between the pad and the rotor, and on the other side not so much at all. And that's why you have to shim these up, because it will make that space the same on both sides, and that way you'll get contact at the same time and you'll avoid the squeakiness, excessive pad wear, and so forth. So the idea here is very simple. We're going to take 4 measurements with a feeler gauge to see how much space there is between the pad and the rotor. Now the rotors have not been installed yet, and the pistons are all the way out, meaning the pads are not compressed up against the rotor. We want to do this before we run fluid through it and compress the pads up against the rotor. We need the space. We want to know what the full travel is and what the full space is between on either side. So once we get the measurements on the top and the bottom, on the inside and the outside, and I would highly suggest you writing these down at the same time. That way it's easier to do the math. But once you get that done, it's a matter of taking the caliper back off and putting the shims in so you can move the caliper over so it will center itself on the rotor. Now, you're going to do this a few times. It's not a one time and you're done type of thing. I mean, certainly you can get a little lucky with it, but for the most part, you're probably going to have this off 2 or 3 times. You don't need to torque it each time. It's just a matter of snugging the caliper down and making sure what the measurement is, and then taking it back off, doing a little simple math, and then putting the right shim in, and then you're done. So I'm going to show you what the math is behind this, and then we'll select the proper shims to put in here. So once you take the measurements of those 4 places, let's concentrate on the top side. So let's say on your inside measurement, you're at 90 thousandths. On your outside measurement, let's say you're at 65 thousandths. So you subtract the inside measurement from the top outside measurement, and that will give you, in this case, 25 thousandths. Now we'll divide that in half, which will give us 12.5 thousandths. However, there isn't a shim that's that size, so we're going to use the 10 thousandths shim. Now that's a really good example because it will show you why we're going to go one way instead of rounding up, we'll round down. And here's the reason why. Baer says that they want about a 5,000th or less tolerance between the two. So once it's all said and done, for example, if you're at 60 thousandths on one side and 65 thousandths on the other, you are within that 5 thousandths tolerance range, and that will keep the pads contacting the rotor equally at the same time within reason. I mean, you're obviously, you're not going to split that 5 thousandths. It's a pretty small number. So if you can get it within that tolerance, which you can, it's just a matter of using the right shims, then it will bring everything together at the same time. And again, the pads will wear correctly. They won't squeak, rattle, make a bunch of noise, and the rotors will certainly wear a lot better too. Now here's where you're going to probably have to do this a couple of times, because in this case, and in this example, is even when it requires a 10,000 shim, it may not be enough. If you are a little careless in your measurement, if the gap was wider than what your feeler gauge is, which I've seen that before, where in this feeler gauge, it's I think stacked, it's 93 thousandths And I've certainly seen them where it's over that, and you have to guess what the dimension is on the gap. And now in the case of these calipers and rotors, I had such a large gap on the inside, which is okay because we're going to try to shift the caliper out to bring the two measurements on the inside and outside together, that I just started with a 50 thousandths shim on the top and the bottom. Once I did the first initial measurement and realized how far it was off, threw the 50 thousandths in there, and that way I can take a more accurate measurement with the feeler gauge to see what these dimensions look like. And that's where you start to break these numbers down and, you know, figure out what size shim you need to put in there to move the caliper over half the distance of what the dimension says it is, because that will put you equal to where the pads are up against the rotor, if that makes sense. So let's talk about where the shims go. There's a couple of brackets that make up this assembly. There's one that bolts to the spindle that holds the whole assembly. Then there's an intermediate bracket that the caliper bolts to, which bolts to the bracket that goes onto the spindle. In between there, that intermediate bracket and the bracket that is on the spindle is where you put the shim at. And that shim goes in between the bracket that's bolted onto the spindle and the bracket that's bolted onto the caliper, and that is what moves the caliper outwards, outbound, to take up the slack to get it right. Now, I've seen this question 100 times of why do you need shims? Why is this necessary? Shouldn't be the tolerances be a little bit tighter? Well, yes and no. When you're putting a aftermarket brake system on a suspension that's 50 years old, that the tolerance is a little bit different on, that never had a OE style disc brake setup on it, it was only made for drums, you're going to have to do a little bit of adjustment here, and that's why you have to shim the caliper to match the rotor. There's no way that Baer or any other manufacturer could get this accurately dead on. You're going to have to shim the caliper to get it on there right, so the pads wear correctly, they contact at the same time, etc. So again, once you get all this done, everything's done, you get the correct spec on both sides, you're within that 5 thousandths, that's just a matter of torquing everything down and you're pretty much done. Then you can go on with the rest of the install. Don't skip this step. If you do skip this, you're going to have a very noisy set of brakes. The pads are going to wear inconsistently, they're going to squeak, you're going to have a heck of a time with it. You're going to wonder why your setup isn't working properly. It's not impossible to do this, but it does take a little bit of patience with it because, like I said, you're going to have to go on and off a few times. One other little tip here is I've always used a little bit of dab anti-seize on everything, because when you're talking about aluminum on these intermediate brackets, on any bracket that's on here, it's certainly a good idea. Baer does not recommend that. They've always assembled theirs dry. Now, you can do that, but depending on what kind of conditions that you're in, whatever, if you've ever tried to disassemble something that's been put together on an aluminum bracket with a steel bolt, you know what happens. Another little quick tip here is with a Sharpie marker, go ahead and write the size of the shim on it when you take it out of the package, because if you don't, I guarantee you when you're swapping these in and out, back and forth, trying to add or take away from it, you're going to get it screwed up and you're going to forget which is which. So the Sharpie stays on there, no problem at all, as you're getting and trying to find the right size. So go ahead and write that on there. Trust me, you'll thank me for that one later. I hope you guys got something out of this one. If you're installing your Baer brakes, take the good time, do the shims right. You'll thank yourself later for it. Again, it's not that complicated, but it just does take a few minutes. And once you get it dialed in and get one corner done and see how easy it is, the rest of the corners go fairly well. Same process procedure on the rear as well. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to leave them down below. I appreciate you liking the video. If you thought it was cool, you got something out of it. And as always, if you want to subscribe, I'd love that too. So anyway, if you got any questions, leave them down below and I'll try to answer them for you. See you guys later.